A security guard found two little black girls crying outside the hospital at midnight. When he discovered why they were alone, his hands started trembling. George Martinez rubbed his tired eyes and checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The night shift at Metro General had barely started, and the rain drummed steadily against the security booth's windows. He adjusted his name tag, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out for another round. The hospital's automatic doors whooshed open and closed behind him. His boots squeaked against the recently mopped floor of the empty lobby. Night shifts were always quiet, except for the occasional emergency coming through the ER entrance on the other side of the building. Evening, George, Nancy, the night receptionist, called out as he passed her desk. "Getting nasty out there." "Sure is." He tapped his flashlight against his leg. "Gonna be a long night." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as George made his way down the main corridor. 15 years of night security work had taught him every corner of this place. Every squeaky tile, every flickering light that maintenance kept promising to fix. His radio crackled. "Base to George." He unclipped it from his belt. "Go ahead, base. Everything quiet on your end?" "All quiet." George paused by a window, watching water stream down the glass. "Though this rain might bring us some excitement later." "Copy that. Base out." George continued his rounds, checking doors, noting the occasional nurse hurrying past with charts or medications. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mixed with the burnt coffee scent wafting from the nurse's station. At midnight, he reached the main entrance again. Through the glass doors, the rain had turned into a downpour. Lightning flashed, illuminating the parking lot and the covered walkway where patients usually got dropped off. That's when he saw them. Two small figures huddled against the wall, partially hidden behind a concrete pillar. George squinted. In the dim light, he could make out pink dresses, now soaked and dirty. Two little girls, no more than 6 or 7 years old. His hand instinctively went to his radio, but he hesitated. Hospital protocol was clear about unaccompanied minors. Call the police immediately. But something made him pause. George pushed through the doors, the rain immediately soaking into his uniform. "Hey there," he called out softly, trying not to startle them. The girls flinched. The older one pulled the younger behind her, their eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," George said, crouching down to their level. "I'm just a security guard. Are you lost?" The younger girl sniffled, wiping her nose with a wet sleeve. Her hair was done up in neat braids, now dripping with rain. The older sister, they had to be sisters, they looked so alike, kept one arm protectively around her. "What are your names?" George tried again. "I'm George." He tapped his name tag, giving them what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Lightning flashed again, followed by a loud crack of thunder. The younger girl yelped and buried her face in her sister's shoulder. "I'm Lisa," the older girl finally said. "This is my sister Amy. She's scared of thunder." George nodded. "Well, Lisa and Amy, you must be cold out here. Why don't we go inside where it's dry?" Lisa shook her head. "We can't leave. Mommy's inside." George's stomach tightened. "Your mom's in the hospital. She wouldn't wake up." Amy suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. "There was all this blood, and the ambulance came, and..." She burst into tears. Lisa hugged her sister tighter. "They wouldn't let us ride in the ambulance. Said we had to wait for our aunt, but she lives really far away, and we didn't know what to do, so we walked here, and walked here." George interrupted. "In this rain? How far did you walk?" "From Pine Street," Lisa said. "Maybe 10 blocks." George felt his hands start to shake. Two little girls, walking alone at night through one of the roughest parts of town. They could have been. He pushed the thought away. "Listen," he said, "I know you're worried about your mom, but you can't stay out here in the rain. You'll get sick." He glanced over his shoulder at the security booth. It wasn't exactly allowed, but how about this? My security booth is right inside those doors. It's warm and dry. You can wait there while I try to find out about your mom. "Okay." The girls exchanged looks. Another thunderclap made them jump. "Will you help us find Mommy?" Amy asked, her voice small. George's chest tightened. 20 years ago, he'd lost his own daughter, Maria, in a car accident. She'd been about Amy's age. The same frightened look in her eyes when he pushed that memory away too. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll help you find your mom. But first, Let's get you warm and dry. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. George stood up, his knees protesting. Follow me. They walked through the automatic doors, leaving wet footprints on the floor. Nancy looked up from her computer, her eyes widening at the sight of the two soaked children. George, she started. I'll handle it, he said quickly, leading the girls past the desk. He could feel Nancy's concerned gaze following them. The security booth wasn't much, just a small room with monitors, a desk, and a couple of chairs, but it was warm and dry. George found some paper towels in a drawer and handed them to the girls. Hey, dry off a bit. I'll see if I can find some blankets. While the girls dabbed at their wet clothes, George radioed maintenance. Hey, Chuck, you got any spare blankets in Lost and Found? Think so. Want me to bring them up? Yeah, thanks. And, maybe some hot chocolate from the cafeteria if they're still open. A pause. George, what are you up to? Just help me out here, Chuck. Please. A sigh crackled over the radio. Be there in 10. George turned back to the girls. They stood close together, still dripping, looking impossibly small and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights. Your mom, he said gently. What's her name? I can try to find out how she's doing. Sarah Williams, Lisa said. She works at the grocery store on 5th Street. George wrote the name down. Okay. And how old are you two? I'm 7, Lisa said. Amy's 5. 7 and 5. Jesus. Walking alone at night in the rain. Chuck arrived with blankets and 2 cups of hot chocolate. He raised an eyebrow at the girls but didn't say anything when George shook his head slightly. After Chuck left, George helped wrap the blankets around the girls' shoulders and handed them the hot chocolate. Amy took a small sip, then a bigger one, chocolate mustache forming above her lip. Good? George asked. She nodded, the first hint of a smile he'd seen on her face. I need to make some calls about your mom, George said. You two stay right here. Okay. Don't open the door for anyone but me. What if we need to use the bathroom? Lisa asked practically. I'll take you. Just wait for me to come back. George stepped out of the booth, his mind racing. He was definitely breaking protocol. If his supervisor found out he had 2 unaccompanied minors in his security booth instead of calling the police immediately. But looking back through the booth's window, seeing those 2 little girls huddled together under blankets, sipping hot chocolate, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. His radio crackled again. Base to George. Everything okay down there? George watched Amy lean against her sister, her eyes starting to droop despite her obvious effort to stay awake. Yeah, he said. Everything's fine. It wasn't fine. Not even close. But for now, at least the girls were safe and warm. The rest, well, he'd figure that out as he went along. He had to. I'm going to help you, he whispered, more to himself than to the girls. I promise. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the small security booth, 2 little girls had found a temporary haven. And George Martinez, who'd spent 15 years watching life pass by from behind a security desk, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: purpose. Now he just had to figure out what to do next. George's fingers hovered over the computer keyboard. Sarah Williams, the name stared back at him from the emergency room admission logs. Female, 32, severe head trauma, internal bleeding. Current status, critical. Damn, he muttered, rubbing his face. Through the security booth's window, he could see Lisa and Amy curled up in their chairs, empty hot chocolate cups on the desk. Amy had finally fallen asleep, her head resting on her sister's shoulder. Lisa's eyes were half closed, but she jerked awake every few minutes, fighting exhaustion. The clock on the wall showed 1:15 a.m. George picked up his radio, then put it down again. One call to the police, and this would all be by the book. The girls would be safe, properly processed through the system. But they'd also be separated, scared, alone in some stranger's house. His hand went to the small photo he kept in his wallet. Maria smiled back at him, forever 7 years old, forever wearing that pink dress she'd loved so much. The last photo he'd taken of her, 3 days before the accident. What would you want me to do, baby girl? He whispered. The radio crackled, making him jump. George, you there? It was Chuck from maintenance. Yeah, go ahead. Listen, Nancy's asking questions about those kids. You know protocol. I know. George glanced at the girls. Just give me a little time, okay? A long pause. You got 1 hour. Then I gotta report it. Thanks, Chuck. George stood up, his joints protesting. He'd been sitting too long, thinking too hard. He opened the booth door quietly. Lisa, he whispered. You awake? She blinked at him, trying to look alert. Is Mommy okay? George pulled up a chair. She's being taken care of by the doctors. But I need to ask you some questions, okay? Important ones. Lisa nodded, carefully shifting so she wouldn't wake Amy. Your aunt? The one who lives far away. What's her name? Do you have a phone number? Aunt Jenny. Lisa's face scrunched up in concentration. I don't know her number. Mommy has it in her phone. But her phone was all broken and bloody. George's stomach clenched. What about other family? Grandparents? Uncle? Lisa shook her head. Grandma died last year. And Daddy? She trailed off, looking down. What about your dad? He left when Amy was a baby. Mommy says he lives in Florida now. Of course he did. George felt a flash of anger at this unknown man who'd abandoned his family. Any neighbors who look after you sometimes? Mrs. Rodriguez next door sometimes watches us when Mommy works late. But she's visiting her daughter in Chicago. George checked his watch. 1:30 a.m. Chuck's deadline was ticking away. A memory hit him suddenly. Maria, sitting in this same security booth years ago, coloring in her notebook while he worked. Back when the hospital allowed employees' kids to stay during emergencies. Before the liability concerns. Before the strict protocols. Please don't call the police, Lisa said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. At school, Tamika said when the police came to her house, they took her and her brother to different homes. I can't, her voice cracked. I promised Mommy I'd take care of Amy. George felt his chest tighten. When did you make that promise? When the ambulance came. Mommy was on the floor, but she grabbed my hand and said, take care of your sister. Then she closed her eyes, and I couldn't wake her up. And Lisa started crying, trying to stay quiet so she wouldn't wake Amy. George handed her a tissue. Listen to me, Lisa. You've been very brave, taking care of your sister. But now you need to let someone help you both. Are you going to help us? The question hung in the air. George thought about his empty house, about the spare room that used to be Maria's, still painted pale pink, about his savings account, meant for a retirement he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. His radio crackled again. George! Chuck's voice. Time's almost up. George made a decision. Yeah, I'm going to help you. He keyed his radio. Chuck, tell Nancy to cover the front desk. I need you to come watch the booth for an hour. What are you going to do? Something I'll probably get fired for. George stood up and gently shook Amy awake. She blinked at him, confused. Come on, girls. We're going on a little trip. Where? Lisa asked, helping Amy stand up. First, to see your mom. Then to my house. I have a spare room, and it's better than sleeping in chairs. Chuck appeared at the booth door, his face worried. George, man, think about what you're doing. I have. George helped the girls gather their blankets. Call it a temporary solution until we figure something out. You could lose your job. Yeah. George managed a small smile. Wouldn't be the worst thing I've lost. He led the girls through the quiet hospital corridors, using his security clearance to access the ICU floor. Outside their mother's room, he crouched down to their level. Now, your mom has a lot of machines helping her get better. It might look scary, but those machines are her friends, okay? They nodded solemnly. Inside, Sarah Williams lay still and pale, tubes and wires connecting her to beeping monitors. The girls gripped George's hands tightly. Mommy, Amy whispered. Lisa moved closer to the bed. We're here, Mommy. We're okay. George gave them a few minutes with their mother, his mind racing through what he needed to do next. His house wasn't ready for children. He'd need food, clothes, school supplies eventually. His savings would take a hit, but a nurse appeared in the doorway. So, visiting hours, George showed his security badge. Just 5 more minutes. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Finally, George guided the girls out. Time to go, but we'll come back tomorrow. Promise. In the parking lot, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. George helped the girls into his old Honda Civic, making sure they were buckled in. It's about a 50-minute drive to my house, he said, starting the engine. Try to get some sleep if you can. In the rearview mirror, he watched Amy lean against Lisa, their eyes already closing. Two little girls, trusting him completely. The weight of that trust pressed on his chest. What am I doing? He whispered to himself. But as he drove through the quiet streets, George knew exactly what he was doing. He was breaking every rule in the hospital security handbook. He was risking his job, maybe even legal trouble. And he didn't care. Because 20 years ago, he couldn't save his daughter. But maybe, just maybe, he could help save these girls. The rain stopped as they turned onto his street. The old Victorian house he'd bought after Maria's death loomed ahead, dark and quiet. Tomorrow, he'd have to face the consequences of his decision. He'd have to figure out legal guardianship, social services, school enrollment, 1,000 details he hadn't thought through. But tonight, he could give two scared little girls a safe place to sleep. Tonight, he could keep a sister's promise to protect her younger sibling. Tonight, that would have to be enough. The morning sun crept through George's kitchen window as he scrambled eggs at the stove. Behind him, Lisa and Amy sat at his old oak table, their feet dangling from chairs too tall for them. "Do you want cheese in your eggs?" he asked, trying to remember how Maria had liked hers. "Yes, please," they answered in unison. George's phone buzzed again. Fourth time in an hour. Chuck's messages grew increasingly urgent. "Boss is asking questions. Where are you? Call in sick at least. They're reviewing security footage." He turned off the phone. "Mr. George." Amy's small voice pulled him back. "Can we see Mommy today?" George slid the eggs onto two plates. "Yes, but first we need to." The doorbell rang. Lisa's fork clattered against her plate. George's heart jumped to his throat. "Girls," he said quietly, "go upstairs to the pink room. Quick and quiet, like we practiced." They scrambled up the stairs as George walked to the door, straightening his shirt. Through the peephole, he saw Kevin Barnes, his supervisor, standing on the porch in his press security uniform. George took a deep breath and opened the door. "Kevin!" "George!" Kevin's eyes moved past him, scanning the living room. "Mind if I come in?" Before George could answer, Kevin stepped inside. His nose twitched at the smell of breakfast. "Expecting company?" "Just hungry." George tried to keep his voice casual. "What brings you by?" Kevin pulled out his tablet. Interesting security footage from last night. Two unaccompanied minors in the lobby around midnight. "You made contact with them." He looked up. "Care to explain why there's no incident report?" A floorboard creaked upstairs. Kevin's head snapped toward the sound. "House settling," George said quickly. "It's old." "George!" Kevin's voice hardened. "Where are the girls?" A soft sob drifted down the stairs, followed by a whispered shish. Kevin strode toward the staircase. George grabbed his arm. "Wait, this is serious, George. Harboring minors, violation of protocol, potential kidnapping charges. Their mother's in ICU," George cut in. "They walked 10 blocks in the rain. Was I supposed to let them freeze?" "You were supposed to call the police. So they could be separated, thrown into the system. That's not our problem." Kevin yanked his arm free. "We're security guards, not social workers. You're risking everything, your job, your freedom. I don't care." The words came out stronger than George expected. Kevin stared at him. "What?" "I said I don't care." George straightened up. 20 years I've worked security. 20 years following protocols, filing reports, looking the other way. Not this time. "George!" "No." George stepped between Kevin and the stairs. "You want to fire me? Fine. Want to call the police? Go ahead. But those girls stay together." Heavy silence filled the house. Then footsteps on the stairs. Lisa appeared, holding Amy's hand. "Please don't make us leave," Lisa said. Her chin trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "We'll be good. We promise." Amy nodded, tears streaming down her face. Kevin looked at the girls, then at George. His jaw worked back and forth. Finally, he sighed. "You have 1 hour to get to the hospital and explain this to administration. After that, I call it in." He turned and walked out, letting the door slam behind him. George sagged against the wall. Lisa rushed down the stairs and threw her arms around his waist. "We can't go back to the hospital," she said into his shirt. "They'll take us away." George patted her head. "No, they won't. But we need help." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Diana? It's George Martinez. Remember that favor you owe me? I need a family lawyer. Now." 30 minutes later, George parked at the hospital. He helped the girls out of the car, holding their hands as they walked through the main entrance. Nancy's eyes widened when she saw them. "George, what are you? Not now." He led the girls toward the elevator. The hospital administrator's office loomed ahead. Through the glass walls, George could see Kevin, the hospital's legal counsel, and two people he didn't recognize. "Girls," he crouched down. "Remember what we talked about? The nice lady in the blue suit is Mr. Diana. She's going to help us. Just tell the truth about last night." "Okay." They nodded solemnly. Inside the office, Diana stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Martinez and his wards," she announced, as if daring anyone to contradict her. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, forms, and legal terms George barely understood. Diana's voice stayed calm and professional as she laid out their case. "My client acted to prevent immediate harm to two minors. Given the circumstances and his clean record, we're prepared to file for emergency temporary guardianship. This is highly irregular," the hospital lawyer sputtered. "So is leaving two children to wander the streets at night," Diana shot back. A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in. "Sorry, but it's about Sarah William, Mr. She's awake." The girls jumped up. George grabbed their hands before they could run out. "Wait," he said. "We need permission." "Go," the administrator said quietly. "We'll continue this later." They hurried to the ICU. Outside Sarah's room, George stopped the girls. "Remember, Mommy's still very weak. Be gentle, okay?" Inside, Sarah Williams lay pale against the white sheets, but her eyes were open. When she saw her daughters, tears rolled down her cheeks. "My babies," she whispered. The girls rushed to the bed. George hung back, watching as Sarah weakly hugged her daughters. "We were so scared," Lisa said. "But Mr. George helped us. He gave us food and a place to sleep in." Sarah's eyes found George. "You took care of my girls?" He nodded. "They are safe. They've been very brave." Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's face. "Thank you," she mouthed. A doctor appeared with a clipboard. "Mr. Williams needs rest now." The girls protested until George promised they'd come back later. In the hallway, Diana waited with more papers. "We've got temporary guardianship," she said. "But there's a hearing next week. It won't be easy." George looked at the girls, now chattering excitedly about their mom waking up. "Nothing worth doing ever is," he said. Back home that evening, George watched the girls play with some old toys he'd found in Maria's room. His phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. "You're suspended pending investigation. Hope you know what you're doing." George deleted the message. The girls had already missed 2 days of school. They needed clothes, supplies, proper beds. His savings would take a hit. But watching Amy show Lisa a picture she'd drawn, 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, George knew there was no turning back. And he didn't want to. George sat in Diana's law office, staring at the stack of papers on her desk. His retirement account statement lay on top, the numbers making his head spin. 30,000, Diana said, tapping the paper with a manicured nail. "That's what we're looking at for legal fees, home inspection preparations, and immediate childcare expenses." George's throat felt dry. "I have 43,000 saved. You'll need the rest for the girls." Diana leaned back in her chair. "School supplies, clothes, food, medical care. Children are expensive, George." "I know." He rubbed his face. "How long do we have?" "The emergency hearing is in 5 days. Social services will conduct a home inspection tomorrow." And she checked her phone. "The hospital board meets in 2 hours to discuss your suspension." George nodded. "Time to face the music. What do we do first?" Diana pulled out a checklist. "Home inspection is critical. You need proper beds, childproofing, smoke detectors, food in the fridge. Basic necessities that show you can provide a stable environment." "I can handle that." "Next, character references. I need at least 3 people who can testify to your capability as a guardian." George thought of Chuck, Nancy, even Kevin. Would any of them help now? "And George." Diana's voice softened. "We need to talk about Maria." His hands clenched. "What about her?" "Social services will bring it up. They'll question whether you're emotionally ready to care for children after losing your daughter." The familiar pain squeezed his chest. "That was 20 years ago, which is why you've kept her room exactly as it was." George stood up abruptly. "I need to get to the hospital board meeting." Diana sighed. George, I'm on your side. But if we're going to win this, you need to be honest. With me, with social services, and with yourself. He paused at the door. The girls need me. Yes. But do you need them? He left without answering. At the hospital, George found Lisa and Amy in the pediatric waiting room where Chuck had agreed to watch them. They jumped up when they saw him. Can we see Mommy? Amy asked. Soon. First, I have a meeting. Chuck will take you to get lunch in the cafeteria. Lisa grabbed his hand. Are they going to fire you? Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. Don't worry about that. He squeezed her hand. Just stay with Chuck? Okay. The boardroom felt colder than he remembered. 8 pairs of eyes watched him take a seat at the long table. Hospital Director Stevens spoke first. Mr. Martinez, your record here has been exemplary. 15 years, not a single complaint. Until now. George stayed silent. You violated multiple protocols. Harbored minors without authorization. Used hospital resources for personal purposes. Those girls needed help, George said quietly. That's not your job. Stevens' fist hit the table. We have procedures, protocols. With all due respect, George cut in. Your procedures would have separated 2 terrified little girls who'd just watched their mother collapse. The proper authorities would have put them in separate foster homes before their mother even woke up. Silence fell. George continued, his voice steady. Fire me if you have to. But I'd do it again. Stevens studied him for a long moment. You understand we can't ignore this breach of protocol. I understand. However, Stevens glanced at the other board members. Given your record, we're willing to convert your suspension to administrative leave. Unpaid, of course. George blinked. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. One condition. You obtain legal guardianship through proper channels. If you fail, termination will be immediate. Outside the boardroom, George leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. 1 hurdle down. His phone buzzed. Diana. Social services moved up the home inspection. They'll be there in 2 hours. George's stomach dropped. 2 hours? But, get moving. I'll meet you there. He found Chuck and the girls in the cafeteria. Amy had chocolate pudding on her face. We need to go. Now. At home, George rushed around like a tornado. He sent the girls to clean Maria's room. Their room now, he corrected himself, while he tackled the kitchen. Empty fridge. No child-safe cleaning supplies. Expired fire extinguisher. His phone buzzed again. A text from Nancy. Heard about the board meeting. Bringing supplies. Hold tight. 20 minutes later, his porch looked like a shopping mall exploded. Nancy arrived with groceries. Chuck brought tools and safety equipment. Even Kevin showed up with 2 new twin beds in his truck. Don't read into this, Kevin grumbled, helping Chuck assemble the beds. I just had them in storage. George wanted to hug them all. Diana arrived just as they finished. She walked through the house, making notes. Better than I expected. But George. She stopped in front of Maria's, the girls' room. The pink walls. We'll paint them, he said quickly. This weekend. She nodded. Good. Because they are here. A black SUV pulled up outside. 2 social workers stepped out, carrying clipboards. The next hour stretched like taffy. They measured window heights, checked water temperature, counted electrical outlets. They interviewed George about his income, his support system, his plans for the girls' education. Finally, in the kitchen, the lead social worker, Mr. Thompson, laid down her clipboard. Mr. Martinez, your friend's support is impressive. But I have concerns. Here it comes, George thought. Your daughter's death was traumatic. You've lived alone for 20 years. Taking in 2 young children, especially under these circumstances. I know it looks crazy, George said. But those girls need stability. Their mother's recovering. They are scared, confused. I can help by replacing your lost daughter. The question hit like a slap. George gripped the counter. No one can replace Maria, he said, his voice rough. But maybe losing her taught me something. About what scared kids need. About not letting protocols and procedures trump basic human decency. Mr. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. The hearing is in 4 days, she finally said. We'll submit our report then. After they left, George sat heavily at the kitchen table. Diana squeezed his shoulder. You did good. Now we prepare for the hearing. Mr. George. Lisa stood in the doorway, holding Amy's hand. Are they going to take us away? He held out his arm. Mister, the girls ran to him, burrowing into his embrace. No, he said firmly. We're going to fight for you to stay. All of us. He looked around his kitchen, at the new child locks on cabinets, the stocked fridge, the crayon drawings already stuck to his refrigerator. 4 days to convince a judge he could do this. 4 days to prove he wasn't crazy, or living in the past, or trying to replace his daughter. 4 days to save his new family. We'll need more pudding, Amy said seriously, making them all laugh. And in that moment, looking at these 2 little girls who'd crashed into his life like a thunderstorm, George knew Diana's question had an answer. Yes, he needed them, as much as they needed him. Now he just had to prove it to everyone else. George stared at his bank account balance on the computer screen. $11,247.32. He closed the browser and looked around his transformed living room. 2 backpacks sat by the door, stuffed with new school supplies. Shopping bags full of clothes lined the walls. The credit card receipts felt like they were burning a hole in his wallet. Mr. George. Lisa called from upstairs. Amy spilled water on her bed. He grabbed paper towels from the kitchen. 3 days until the hearing, and everything that could go wrong did. Upstairs, Amy stood beside her bed in Pokemon pajamas, lower lip trembling. I'm sorry. It's okay. Kiddo. George stripped the wet sheets. Accidents happen. Is Mommy coming home soon? Amy asked, helping him gather the sheets. George's hands paused. Sarah's condition had improved, but soon was relative. The doctors want to keep her a few more weeks. Remember what we talked about? Lisa sat on her bed, hugging her knees. We have to be patient. The doorbell rang. George checked his watch, 7:30 p.m. Diana wasn't due until tomorrow. Girls, stay up here, he said, heading downstairs. Through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Carson from next door, holding what looked like a casserole dish. He opened the door. Evening, Mrs. Carson. George. She thrust the dish at him. Chicken pot pie. I noticed you have, guess. The way she said it made his spine stiffen. Yes, I'm looking after 2 girls while their mother recovers. Mrs. Carson's eyes narrowed. People are talking, George. A single man, your age, suddenly taking in 2 young girls. Heat rose in his neck. Their mother is in the hospital. So you say. But no one's seen any proof. And with your history, my history, well, after what happened with your daughter, stop. George's voice could have frozen water. Thank you for the pot pie, Mrs. Carson. Good night. He closed the door on her startled face, hands shaking as he set the dish on the kitchen counter. Mr. George. Lisa stood in the doorway. What happened with your daughter? He gripped the counter. You should be in bed. Was she sick? Lisa, did she die? George turned. Lisa stood there in her new purple pajamas, looking older than 7. Yes, he said quietly. Her name was Maria. She was in a car accident 20 years ago. Is that why you helped us? Because of her. Before he could answer, Amy appeared behind her sister, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I had a bad dream, she whispered. George pushed away from the counter. Come on, both of you. Hot chocolate time. Minutes later, they sat at the kitchen table, 3 mugs steaming between them. Amy had whipped cream on her nose. Maria loved hot chocolate too, George found himself saying. Especially with extra marshmallows. Like me. Amy grinned. Yeah. George smiled. Like you? Do you miss her? Lisa asked. Every day. Does it make you sad, having us in her room? George met her eyes. No. It makes me happy, knowing her room is helping 2 other little girls who need it. Lisa nodded, understanding beyond her years. Now, George said, bedtime. For real this time. After tucking them in, George sat in his living room, surrounded by evidence of his new life. His phone buzzed. Diana. Bad news, she said without preamble. Social Services is expediting their investigation. Hearing's been moved up to tomorrow afternoon. George's stomach dropped. Tomorrow? But we're not ready. We have to be. And George? They are bringing in a child psychologist to evaluate your mental state. What? Someone filed a complaint. Suggested you might be unstable. Using the girls to replace Maria. Mrs. Carson. Had to be. I'm not, I know. But be ready for hard questions. About Maria, about your motivations, everything. George hung up and put his head in his hands. The sound of soft footsteps made him look up. Lisa stood there, holding a piece of paper. "I made this," she said, handing it to him. It was a crayon drawing. 4 figures holding hands, 3 tall ones, 1 short. Labels in careful child writing. "Mommy, Mr. George, me, Amy. See?" Lisa pointed. "When Mommy gets better, we can all be together." George's vision blurred. "It's beautiful. Are you crying?" "No." He wiped his eyes. "Just tired. Come on, back to bed." Upstairs, he tucked her in again. Amy was already asleep, snoring softly. "Mr. George," Lisa whispered, "I'm glad you found us that night." "Me too, sweetheart." "Me too." Back downstairs, George stared at the drawing. His phone buzzed again. Chuck this time. "Heard about tomorrow. We'll all be there. The whole night shift crew." George swallowed hard. "Thanks. Get some sleep. Man, tomorrow's gonna be rough." But sleep wouldn't come. George paced his house, checking locks, adjusting thermostats, straightening already stray pictures. In Maria's old room, the girls' room now, he paused. The pink walls were partially painted blue, their weekend project interrupted by endless paperwork and preparations. Old toys mixed with new ones. Change and memory, past and present, all swirling together. His wallet fell from his pocket. Maria's photo slipped out, landing face up on the carpet. George picked it up, studying his daughter's frozen smile. "What would you think of all this, baby girl?" The photo didn't answer, but somewhere in his heart, he knew. Maria would have loved these girls. Would have wanted her room, her toys, her father's love to help others. The first light of dawn crept through the windows. George hadn't slept, but clarity had come with the sunrise. He wasn't trying to replace Maria. He was honoring her memory by helping 2 little girls who needed what he could give: safety, stability, love. Now he just had to make a judge understand that. His phone alarm buzzed. 6:30 a.m. Time to wake the girls, make breakfast, pack lunches, and prepare for the fight of his life. In the kitchen, he found Lisa already up, attempting to pour cereal. "Need help?" She nodded, milk sloshing over the bowl's edge. As George cleaned up the spill, he heard Amy singing to herself upstairs, the same silly song Maria used to sing while getting dressed. Different girl, different time, same joy. And suddenly, George knew they would win today. Because this wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. The courthouse lobby smelled like floor polish and anxiety. George adjusted his tie for the 10th time, watching Lisa and Amy sit perfectly still in their new dresses. Diana paced nearby, checking her phone. "Remember what we practiced?" she said. "Short, honest answers. No rambling." George nodded. His stomach felt like a washing machine on spin cycle. Chuck appeared through the main doors, followed by Nancy and 3 other hospital staff members. Even Kevin showed up, uniform pressed and badge shining. "Quite the support team," Diana noted, approving. The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff called their case number. "Girls." George crouched down to their level. "Whatever happens in there, remember all rise." They shuffled into the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Martinez, no relation, George had checked, peered down from her bench, reading through papers. "Temporary guardianship hearing, case number 2025-47B, she announced. "Mr. George Martinez petitioning for custody of Lisa and Amy Williams, pending their mother's recovery." She looked up. "Where are the minor children's current foster parents?" "Your Honor," Diana stood. "The children have been in Mr. Martinez's emergency care since the incident. No foster placement has occurred." The judge frowned. "Irregular." "Mr. Thompson, your agency's position." The social worker stood. "We have concerns, Your Honor. Mr. Martinez's actions, while well-intentioned, violated numerous protocols. Furthermore, his history." "Objection," Diana cut in. "Mr. Martinez's personal history isn't relevant to his current capability as a guardian." "I'll decide what's relevant," Judge Martinez said. "Continue, Mr. Thompson." "Mr. Martinez lost his daughter 20 years ago in a tragic accident. He's lived alone since then, maintaining her room exactly as it was. Now, suddenly, he takes in 2 girls roughly his daughter's age at time of death. Our psychologist has serious concerns about his motivations." George's hands clenched in his lap. Lisa reached over and gripped his fingers. "Mr. Martinez, the judge said. Why should I grant you temporary guardianship? George stood, his mouth dry. Because those girls need stability, Your Honor. Their mother is recovering. They've been through trauma. Moving them now, separating them, would only cause more harm. And your daughter, Maria, wasn't it? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Thompson suggests you're trying to replace her. No one can replace Maria. George's voice cracked. But losing her taught me something. About what scared kids need. About being there when it matters, even if it costs you your job. Some things matter more than jobs. The judge studied him. Dr. Reynolds, your professional opinion. The court-appointed psychologist stood. Mr. Martinez shows signs of unresolved grief, Your Honor. His quick attachment to these children could indicate. He saved us, Lisa's voice rang out. Young lady, the judge warned, you can't speak unless. He makes us hot chocolate when we're scared. Amy added, and he knows how to braid hair now. Order. The judge tapped her gavel. Mr. Martinez, control your wards. They are right though, Chuck stood up. George has always looked out for others. 20 years on night shift. He's helped countless families through their worst moments. Sit down. So this isn't. I filed the complaint. Mrs. Carson's voice came from the back. And I was wrong. The courtroom turned. Mrs. Carson stood, clutching her purse. I thought, well, it looked suspicious. But I've watched him with those girls this past week. Taking them to school, helping with homework, teaching them to ride bikes in the driveway. He's not replacing anyone. He's just helping. Silence fell. George felt tears pressing behind his eyes. Your Honor, Diana said softly. My client isn't perfect. He broke some rules, yes. But he did it to keep two scared little girls together, to give them safety and stability while their mother heals. Isn't that worth more than protocols? The judge removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. Mr. Thompson, your final thoughts? The social worker hesitated. The home inspection was satisfactory. The children appear well cared for. And their mother, when interviewed, expressed strong support for this arrangement. She did. George hadn't known about that. Mr. Martinez, the judge leaned forward. This is highly irregular. You violated hospital protocols, took in minors without proper authorization, and some might say you're working through personal trauma by doing so. George's heart sank. However, she smiled slightly. Sometimes irregular situations require irregular solutions. The girls are clearly bonded to you. Their mother approves. You have community support. And sometimes, she glanced at a photo on her desk. Sometimes the law needs to recognize when something unusual is actually right. George hardly dared breathe. Temporary guardianship granted, pending monthly reviews and the mother's recovery. Mr. Thompson, schedule regular home visits. Dr. Reynolds, I want monthly counseling sessions for all three of them. Diana, draw up the paperwork. The gavel banged. George sat, stunned, until small arms wrapped around his neck. We can stay, Amy squealed. Lisa hugged him from the other side. You did it. Diana gathered her papers, smiling. Congratulations, George. Now the real work begins. Outside the courtroom, his support team surrounded them. Chuck slapped his back. Nancy hugged the girls. Even Kevin managed a gruff, good job. Mrs. Carson approached cautiously. George, thank you. He cut her off. For telling the truth in there. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Girls need a grandmother figure, she said. If you're interested in some babysitting. George smiled. We'll talk. His phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. Sarah's asking for her daughters. Who wants to go see Mommy? He asked. Two hands shot up immediately. As they walked to the car, Lisa tugged his sleeve. Mr. George. Yes. Can we get ice cream first? He laughed. Ice cream it is. Amy skipped ahead, singing her morning song. Lisa held his hand, chattering about showing her mom her new school clothes. And George Martinez, former night security guard, now temporary guardian of two little girls, felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Complete. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges, school meetings, doctor appointments, learning to be a surrogate parent in his 60s. But watching the girls climb into his car, arguing about ice cream flavors, he knew one thing for certain. Some rules were meant to be broken. Some families were meant to be found. And sometimes, The biggest acts of love started with the smallest acts of rebellion. Mr. George, Amy called from the car. Can we get sprinkles too? Of course, kiddo. All the sprinkles you want. Because today, they had one. Today, they were family. And that was worth everything. The alarm clock buzzed at 6 a.m. George rolled over, muscles aching from painting the girls' room all weekend. 2 weeks had passed since the hearing, and his old routines had transformed completely. Girls, time for school. Footsteps thundered overhead. George smiled. The house hadn't been this loud in decades. In the kitchen, he cracked eggs into a pan while reviewing their morning checklist. Pack lunches, check homework, sign permission slips, Lisa's math test today, Amy's show and tell, Mr. George. Amy's voice carried down the stairs. I can't find my other shoe. Check under your bed. He flipped the eggs. Lisa, you packed your math notebook. Lisa appeared in the kitchen, backpack bulging. Yes, but. She fidgeted with her braids, still not perfect, but George was getting better at them. What if I fail the test? Then we'll work harder for the next one. He slid eggs onto plates. Remember what we practiced? Long division, step by step. She sat at the table. But Jenny says I'm too slow. Jenny's wrong. Better to be slow and right than fast and wrong. Amy bounded in, both shoes found. I'm showing Mr. Bunny for show and tell. The stuffed rabbit needs a proper name, Lisa said around a mouthful of eggs. Mr. Bunny is a proper name. George checked his watch. Less arguing, more eating. Bus comes in 20 minutes. The morning rush continued, finding lost homework, fixing crooked socks, last-minute bathroom trips. Finally, George walked them to the bus stop, joining other parents who'd become familiar faces. George! Mrs. Rodriguez waved. The girls still coming for dinner Friday. If you're sure it's not too much trouble. Nonsense. My tamales will put some meat on their bones. The bus arrived. Amy hugged George's legs. Can we visit Mommy today? After school. She's starting physical therapy. Remember? Lisa gave him a quick hug. Don't forget to buy more milk. Yes, boss. He watched them climb aboard. Have a good day. Love you. The words slipped out naturally. The girls waved from their window. The bus pulled away, and George stood there, processing what he'd just said. Love you. His phone buzzed. Diana. Monthly review tomorrow, she said. How's the documentation? George headed inside, grabbing his folder. All here. School enrollment forms, medical checkups, counseling appointments, and Sarah's recovery progress. Physical therapy starts today. Doctor says another month, maybe 2. Diana paused. George, we should talk about what happens then. He gripped the phone tighter. She's their mother, Diana. Yes, but I've got to go. Meeting the contractor about the bathroom renovation. He hung up, hands shaking slightly. The bathroom needed updating, no question there. The girl shared his single upstairs bathroom, and the plumbing was older than they were. The contractor, Mike, arrived right on time. Quite a change, he said, looking around. Last time I was here, fixing your porch steps, place was like a museum. Now there's life. George nodded. Fresh crayon drawings covered the fridge. Backpacks and shoes cluttered the entryway. A half-finished puzzle dominated the coffee table. Bath needs a complete overhaul, Mike said upstairs. Minimum 10 grand. Another chunk of savings gone. But the girls needed proper facilities. Do it. His phone buzzed again, the hospital. Mr. Martinez? Sarah's asking for you. He found her in the physical therapy room, gripping parallel bars, sweat beading on her forehead. The girls are in school, he said. I know. Sarah took a shaky step. I wanted to talk to you alone. His stomach tightened. The doctors say 2 more months. She took another step. Until I can manage stairs, lift things, take care of my daughters. They are doing great, George said quickly. Lisa's math is improving. And Amy. George. Sarah's eyes met his. I know they are doing great. That's what I want to discuss. She lowered herself into her wheelchair. The physical therapist discreetly left them alone. When I get out, Sarah twisted her hands in her lap. Our apartment's on the 3rd floor. No elevator. I can't afford to move yet. Can't work full-time right away. Sarah, let me finish. She took a deep breath. The girls love you. You've given them stability, safety, a real home. I can't take that away suddenly. George's heart pounded. So I was thinking, maybe we take it slow. I move in with my sister in Chicago, work on getting stronger, finding a better job. The girls stay with you until I'm properly set up. Stay with me. His voice cracked. For how long? Few months, maybe a year. She looked up, tears in her eyes. Unless that's too much to ask. George sat heavily in a nearby chair. They're your daughters. Yes. And as their mother, I want what's best for them. She reached for his hand. You become family, George. To all of us. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. School number. Mr. Martinez? Amy's not feeling well. Fever of 101. 20 minutes later, he carried a sleepy Amy through their front door, her hot forehead against his neck. My tummy hurts, she whimpered. I know, sweetheart. He laid her on the couch, covering her with the soft blanket Chuck had given them. Want some soup? She nodded, clutching Mr. Bunny. George moved around the kitchen, heating soup, finding the children's Tylenol, remembering how Maria had liked ginger ale when she was sick. Amy fell asleep watching cartoons. George sat beside her, smoothing her hair, checking her temperature. His phone buzzed. Lisa, Jenny says I did good on the math test. He smiled, typing back, proud of you. See you at bus stop. Amy's home sick. Another buzz. Sarah, think about what I said. No rush to decide. George looked around his transformed home. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Carson tending her garden, waving when she spotted him. Mike's truck was still outside, starting the bathroom renovation. Bills and school forms covered his desk. But there was also laughter in the walls now. Drawings on the fridge. Small shoes by the door. Love in the air. Amy stirred, feverish eyes blinking up at him. Love you, Mr. George, she mumbled, drifting back to sleep. And there it was again. That word. That feeling. Love. Not replacing the love he'd lost, but growing something new. Something different but equally precious. He texted Sarah back. Nothing to think about. You and the girls are family now. We'll make it work. Because sometimes love wasn't about holding on to the past or worrying about the future. Sometimes it was just about being there, in the present, holding a sick child's hand. Sometimes it was about letting your heart grow bigger than your fears. Hold still, George said, attempting to wrangle Amy's curls into something resembling a braid. How does your mom make this look so easy? You're getting better, Lisa offered from her perch on the bathroom counter. At least it's not sideways this time. It was Saturday morning, 3 months since the hearing. The new bathroom gleamed with fresh tile and modern fixtures. Down the hall, the girls' room had transformed too, walls now a soft blue with clouds Lisa had helped paint. There! George secured the braid with a purple elastic. Done! Amy examined herself in the mirror. The braid listed slightly to the left, but it held. Can we go see Mommy now? After breakfast. She has therapy until 10. In the kitchen, George poured cereal while the girls argued about who got the last banana. Cut it in half, he suggested, pulling out his phone. New text from Sarah. Big surprise today. Don't tell the girls. His heart skipped. Sarah's recovery had progressed faster than expected. Yesterday, she'd managed the hospital stairs without help. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Carson stood outside with a covered dish. Banana bread, she announced. Still warm. The banana argument forgotten, the girls rushed to hug her. Careful of my bad hip, she laughed. George, remember I'm taking them to the park this afternoon so you can run errands. He nodded gratefully. The house needed childproofing for Sarah's upcoming home inspection. Can we feed the ducks? Amy asked. Only if you promise not to try swimming with them like last time. Lisa rolled her eyes. That was one time. George's phone buzzed again. Diana. Monthly review on Monday. Everything ready? He texted back, all good. Sarah's making excellent progress. The truth was more complicated. Sarah's progress meant changes coming, good changes, but changes nonetheless. The girls still didn't know about their mom's plan to let them stay with George while she got back on her feet. Mr. George. Lisa's voice pulled him back. You're burning the toast. Shoot. He rescued the smoking bread. Maybe we should stick to cereal. Mommy says you need cooking lessons, Amy giggled. Oh really? What else does Mommy say? That you're a good man, Lisa said seriously. But you worry too much. George turned away, blinking hard. These moments still caught him off guard. the simple, honest love of children who'd crashed into his life and made it whole again. At the hospital, they found Sarah's room empty. Mrs. Williams is in the garden, a nurse told them. She has a surprise. They headed outside to the hospital's small courtyard. Sarah sat on a bench, no wheelchair in sight. "Mommy!" The girls ran to her. "You're sitting up? Better than that." Sarah stood, arms outstretched. "Look what I can do." The girls froze, then exploded with joy. "You can walk." George watched Sarah hug her daughters, tears streaming down all their faces. His own eyes weren't exactly dry either. "The doctors say I can come home soon," Sarah told them. "But we need to talk about some changes." She caught George's eye. He nodded slightly. "Girls," she said, "how would you feel about staying with Mr. George a bit longer? Even after I'm better?" Amy looked confused. "You don't want us?" "Oh, baby, of course I want you." Sarah pulled her close. "But Mr. George's house is perfect for you, your school, your friends, your room. And I need time to find a better job, a better apartment. So, we'd live with Mr. George but still see you." Lisa asked carefully. "All the time," George said. "Your mom could stay in the guest room whenever she wants. We'd be like a family," Sarah finished. "A different kind, but still family." The girls were quiet, processing. "Can we still have hot chocolate when we're scared?" Amy asked. George laughed. "Always. And weekend pancakes," Lisa added. "Even the burnt ones?" Sarah smiled. "Then okay." Lisa hugged them both. "We can be a different kind of family." Later, while Sarah showed the girls her progress on the therapy equipment, George sat on a bench, overwhelmed. A different kind of family. Not what he'd expected at 65. Not the retirement his colleagues had imagined for him. But watching Sarah teach the girls the exercises she'd learned, hearing their laughter echo across the courtyard, he couldn't imagine anything better. His phone buzzed. A text from Chuck. "Night shift misses you, old man." George smiled. He missed them too, the quiet nights, the familiar routines. But he'd found something else. Something he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Mr. George," Amy called. "Watch me do therapy with Mommy." He joined them, helping Amy balance on the low parallel bars while Sarah demonstrated proper form. "You're a natural," Sarah told him. "At physical therapy. At being a father." The word hit him like a wave. Father. He hadn't heard that word applied to himself in 20 years. "I'm not trying to replace," he started. "I know." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're not replacing anyone. You're just being you. And that's exactly what we all need." That evening, after dropping Sarah back in her room with promises to visit tomorrow, George drove them home. The girls chatted about their mom's progress, about plans for her homecoming, about the duck pond adventures ahead with Mrs. Carson. In the rearview mirror, he watched them, these precious, chattering miracles who'd appeared in the rain one night and changed everything. "Mr. George," Amy yawned. "Can we have hot chocolate tonight? With extra marshmallows," he promised. At home, Mrs. Carson waited on the porch with more banana bread and neighborhood gossip. The house smelled of fresh paint and childhood. Homework lay scattered on the kitchen table. A new family photo, all four of them at the hospital, sat framed on the mantel. Different, yes. Unexpected, certainly. But family all the same. And as George made hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, listening to the girls argue about TV shows and marshmallow ratios, he realized something. He'd spent 20 years guarding an empty house, protecting memories of a life that was gone. Now he was building something new. Something that honored the past while embracing the future. Something that felt exactly right. 1 year later, George stood in his kitchen, watching rain streak the windows. Different storm, different night, same feeling of anticipation in his chest. "Everything ready?" Sarah called from upstairs. "Almost." He checked the cake one last time, chocolate with vanilla frosting, decorated with slightly wobbly letters spelling "Welcome Home." Today marked exactly 1 year since he'd found two scared little girls huddled outside the hospital. 1 year since his life had changed forever. It was also moving day. Sarah, after months of physical therapy and a new job as a hospital administrator, arranged by a grateful hospital director Stevens, was finally ready to move in. Not to the guest room. She found a small house just 3 blocks away. Close enough for daily visits, family dinners, and shared responsibilities. Far enough for everyone to have their space. "Mr. George," Amy's voice carried down the stairs. Lisa's hogging the bathroom. I'm not. Lisa shouted back. Some of us actually care about looking nice for the party. Some things hadn't changed. The doorbell rang. Chuck and Nancy arrived first, carrying gifts and food. Kevin appeared next, grumbling about the rain but hiding a smile. Mrs. Carson and Mrs. Rodriguez came together, arguing about whose tamales were better. Quite a crowd, Sarah said, joining George in the kitchen. She walked with just a slight limp now, the only remaining sign of her injury. Should have seen the RSVPs, George replied. Had to tell half the hospital staff to come tomorrow instead. Popular man. She squeezed his arm. Who would have thought? The grumpy night guard, social butterfly. Watch it, boss. I still know where they keep the bad coffee. They laughed. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have predicted. Not romance, but a deep partnership built on shared love for two little girls. Ladies, George called upstairs. Guests are here. The girls thundered down, dressed in their party best. Amy's braids were perfect. Sarah had done them. Lisa wore the necklace George had given her for her 8th birthday. The party moved into full swing. Hospital staff mixed with neighbors, sharing stories about the past year. Director Stevens made a speech about community and breaking protocols. Diana raised a toast of families of choice. George slipped away to the kitchen for a quiet moment. Through the window, he could see his reflection, older, grayer, but somehow younger in the eyes. Hey, Lisa appeared beside him. You okay? Just thinking. About Maria? He nodded. They talked about her more over the past year. The girls had helped him go through her things, keeping some, donating others. Her photo still sat on his dresser, but now surrounded by new family pictures. She would have liked you too, he said. We know. Lisa hugged him. Amy says she sends us the good dream. Mr. George's throat tightened. Mr. George. Lisa. Amy burst in. Mommy's cutting the cake. They rejoined the party. Sarah stood by the cake, knife poised. Wait! Amy cried. We forgot something. She ran upstairs, returning with a wrapped package. We made this, Lisa explained. All of us. George opened it carefully. Inside lay a photo album, handmade with construction paper and glitter. The cover read Our Family Story. The first page showed a newspaper clipping about the night he found them. Then came photos, the girl's first morning in his house, Sarah in physical therapy, birthday parties, school events. The final page held the crayon drawing Lisa had made a year ago, now laminated and precious. Turn it over, Sarah said softly. On the back, 3 messages, in Amy's wobbly handwriting. Thank you for the hot chocolate and hugs. Love, Amy. In Lisa's careful script. Thank you for finding us that night. You're the best dad ever. Love, Lisa. And in Sarah's elegant hand. Thank you for showing us that family isn't about blood or rules or expectations. It's about love, in all its unexpected form. Mr. Love, Sarah. Dad. They'd never used that word before. George had been Mr. George for a year, careful not to overstep, not to assume. But there it was, in Lisa's careful handwriting. Dad. Speech. Chuck called out, breaking the moment. George wiped his eyes, clutching the album. A year ago, he started, voice rough, I was a night security guard with an empty house and a lot of memories. Then 2 little girls appeared in the rain, and everything changed. Amy beamed. Lisa squeezed his hand. People asked why I did it, why I broke the rules, risked my job, turned my life upside down for strangers. The truth is, I didn't think about any of that. I just knew those girls needed help, and I could give it. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. I thought I was rescuing them, George continued. But really, they rescued me. They, and their amazing mother, showed me that life doesn't end with loss. That love multiplies. It doesn't divide. That family isn't about replacing what's gone, but about growing something new. He looked around the room, at Chuck and Nancy, who'd had his back that first night. At Kevin, who'd bent rules he'd spent decades enforcing. At Mrs. Carson and Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd become surrogate grandmothers. At Diana, who'd fought for this unconventional family in court. Someone once asked if I needed these girls as much as they needed me, he said. The answer is yes. We all needed each other. We still do. Amy ran to hug him. Lisa followed. Sarah completed the circle. To family, Diana called out, raising her glass. To family, the room echoed. Later, after the guests left and the girls were in bed, George stood in his backyard. The rain had stopped. Stars peeked through breaking clouds. Sarah joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just wondering," he said, "if anything's still open at midnight." She looked confused. "The girls want hot chocolate," he explained. "Tradition, you know. 1-year anniversary." Sarah laughed. "I bought extra marshmallows yesterday. They're in the pantry." Of course she had. Because that's what family did. Remembered the little things, anticipated the needs, filled in the gaps. Inside, they found the girls already in the kitchen, pajama-clad and hopeful. "Hot chocolate?" Amy asked. "With extra marshmallows," George confirmed. They sat at the kitchen table, 4 mugs steaming between them. "Just like that first night, but different." "Better. Tell us again," Amy said, marshmallow cream on her nose. "About the night you found us." "Well," George began, catching Sarah's eye and Lisa's smile. "It was raining, and I was doing my rounds." The story flowed, familiar now but never tiring. Because it wasn't just about that night anymore. It was about everything that came after. The tears and laughter, the challenges and triumphs, the love that grew in unexpected places. It was about 4 people who became family, not because of blood or obligation, but because they chose each other. It was about home. George Martinez, former night security guard, now full-time father figure, looked at his family around the kitchen table and knew with absolute certainty. Some rules were meant to be broken. Some hearts were meant to be healed. And some families were meant to be found, one rainy night at a time.